The galaxy had known many empires and many wars, but there was always one story that kept moving through the stars like a whisper. Humans, a species that some claimed had once walked the galaxy and then vanished. Others said they never existed at. All just myths spoken in old taverns and archived records on dusty stations. The council dismissed such tales, calling them bedtime stories for soldiers who needed courage in the dark. But some remembered the fragments. Some remembered the warnings, and one day they would learn that the whispers were not just myths. It began on a small listening post near the edge of the Orion corridor. The station floated silent and routine, with bored officers tracking trade routes and pirate signals. But that night the sensors screamed. Alarms flared across the deck and the crew rushed to their posts. Commander Lena Hart, a woman known for calm under pressure, leaned over the console as the young officer shouted the words that froze everyone in Armada. Is coming. At first they thought it was a joke. Pirates never moved in such numbers, traders never formed walls of ships. But then the screen lit with thousands of signatures moving with perfect formation. The station crew stared in disbelief. Lena ordered scans. The computer struggled to even count the numbers, and finally the words came. Not pirates, not traders. Unknown configuration. Across the galaxy, reports spread in fragments, trade convoys vanishing, patrol fleets cut down in silence, colonies going dark. People whispered again the old story of humans. Some laughed, but others began to feel the cold hand of fear, because the shapes recorded on fragments of broken sensors looked too familiar. They looked like ships no one had seen in thousands of years, ships described only in legends told by old captains who swore they had once seen humans rise against impossible odds. Back on Earth, forgotten by the galaxy. Humanity had not died. They had gone silent, rebuilding in the shadows while the galaxy believed them gone. They had watched, they had listened. They had prepared in secret. The Armada that now moved was the result of centuries of hidden work. A fleet born from the determination of a species that refused to be erased. In the council chamber, the leaders argued. Alien delegates raised their voices, demanding answers. Some insisted it was a trick. Some claimed it was an invasion. One voice trembled, saying the forbidden word, humans. The chamber roared in denial. But outside the walls, panic spread. Colonies demanded protection. Outposts sent desperate calls for fleets. But no help came quickly enough because the Armada moved with speed. No one expected, on the listening post. Lena tried to keep order. Her crew looked at her with wide eyes. One asked, "Are we about to see them?" The myth, she had no answer. The signals grew stronger. Then the comm lit up. A voice cut through the static. It was clear, strong, and in a language the translators struggled with at first, then adapted. The voice said, "This is Admiral Cole of the United Fleet. We are returning." The crew froze. The word United Fleet rang like thunder. The officer whispered, "United Fleet of humans." Lena stared at the screen. The massive formation drew closer. Not firing, not hostile, but unstoppable. They moved like a storm of steel and fire, but held their weapons. The message repeated, "We are returning, stand down." The council received the same transmission. Panic turned to chaos. Some wanted to open fire. Others begged for talks. None could agree. The old fear returned, the fear of a species that had been whispered about as Deathworlders. Creatures too stubborn to die, too dangerous to forget they thought humans were myths. But now the myths came alive with engines that shook. The stars. In the darkness of her command chair, Lena watched as the Armada filled the horizon. She could not help but feel awe. The scale was beyond anything she had seen. Entire cities seemed to float among the warships, carriers, cruisers, vessels, shaped with harsh lines that spoke of survival, not beauty. They were not here to impress. They were here to last. And every ship carried the weight of centuries hidden in shadow. The galaxy held its breath. The return had begun, and no one knew if it meant salvation or destruction. The Galactic Council chamber was filled with voices that echoed against the tall walls of stone and metal, and the air was heavy with fear, even though many tried to hide it. And the reports that came from the outer rim could not be ignored anymore, because colonies were falling and fleets were being destroyed and whole families were running from one system to another, looking for safety. And yet in the middle of all of this, the counselors sat in their bright robes pretending that order still existed, and their voices rose and fell like waves, but underneath all of it, there was a tremor of dread that none of them wanted to admit. A tall delegate from the Shivari stood and raised his hands and spoke about the raids growing bolder and the pirates striking without warning, and he begged for stronger fleets to be sent. But when he dared to mention the word human, the chamber shifted and voices grew sharp because that word was not welcome. And many laughed, but their laughter carried unease because even those who denied it could not fully erase the stories that had traveled through the stars. Some called humans a myth told to frighten children, some called them a trick of history. But there were those who believed, and they whispered that humans were real, and that they were only waiting. Far away from the council chamber, hidden deep under the skies of Earth, Commander Daniel Harris leaned over a table lit by a holographic glow, and his eyes studied the shifting images of intercepted signals that showed movement of ships on the rim, and he was quiet, but his mind was racing because the shapes of the ships were clear, and the patterns they moved in were familiar to him, and he knew that the galaxy was close to learning the truth. He turned to his team and told them that the day they had waited for was near, and his words carried weight because these men and women had been preparing their whole lives for a moment when the shadows would no longer be enough. Outside, in the dark of space, the hidden armada of humanity drifted silent like steel ghosts waiting for the signal, and every ship was alive with crew who trained in silence and waited with patience. Captain Laura Mitchell walked the deck of her flagship, and her voice was calm, but inside she felt the heavy pull of what was about to come, and she remembered the years of hiding, and she remembered the oath she had taken to stand ready when the time arrived. Ethan Carter stood beside her holding a tablet of reports, and he pointed at the faint traces of enemy fleets pushing deeper into weak systems, and he said the council would soon break because their fleets were scattered and their empires were fragile and their corruption had made them blind, and she agreed with him. In the council chamber the arguments went on, and a voice from the Kyril demanded proof of the rumors, and another voice from the Valari mocked the idea that humans would ever return. And yet a few silent delegates kept their eyes down and did not join the laughter because they had heard whispers in the outer colonies of ships appearing and vanishing like ghosts, and of weapons that fired in silence and left only wreckage behind. That night in the chamber, when the debate finally ended, there was no decision made, only the same old words of delay and promises, and yet outside in the dark of space the truth was already moving closer. Daniel Harris sent encrypted messages through secret channels to Laura Mitchell and Ethan Carter telling them to prepare. And the message was short, but it carried the weight of centuries of silence ending, and Laura closed her eyes and whispered that the myths were about to walk among the stars again. In the far reaches of space, a small colony world named Vela looked up at its sky without knowing what was coming, and children pointed at the stars while parents prayed for safety, and raiders sharpened their blades waiting for the next strike. But unseen above them in the emptiness, the armada of steel waited silent and ready, and the galaxy still thought humans were only a story. The world of Vela had once been quiet, and its people lived simple lives under the glow of two suns, and they believed that the council would always protect them. But in the deep night, when the warning sirens screamed and shadows fell over the sky, they realized the truth that no one was coming to save them. Raiders poured down from orbit in black ships with jagged edges, and they cut through the weak defense fleet in less than an hour, and the colony soldiers tried to hold the line, but their weapons were too old and their ships too slow, and soon the raiders marched in the streets, dragging citizens out of their homes and setting fire to the markets, and the cries of families filled the air. Underground in a shelter, a mother held her child and whispered that they would be safe, but her eyes were wet with fear, and her voice shook because she knew safety was no longer real. Above the planet, the raider fleet celebrated with cruel laughter, and their commander sent messages across the rim boasting of another victory, and they believed nothing could stop them. But then the stars shifted. At first it was only a shadow on the edge of the void, and then another and another, until dozens of massive forms emerged from hyperspace, silent and dark, like the return of ancient giants. The raiders fell silent as they saw the shapes of ships larger and sharper than anything they had ever faced, and their scanners screamed warnings they did not understand. On the bridge of her flagship, Laura Mitchell stood with her hands folded behind her back and her eyes fixed on the enemy fleet, and she gave a single command that carried through the decks like fire, and the armada of humanity came alive. Engines roared like thunder weapons armed with a cold hum, and the silence of centuries broke in an instant. Ethan Carter stood at her side, calling out coordinates, and his voice was steady, as he ordered ground reinforcements to prepare for a dangerous landing on the surface because saving lives mattered as much as defeating the enemy. Across the alien defenses, panic spread because they had heard the word human, whispered in taverns and old stories, but none of them had believed until now, and as they watched the first volleys of human fire tear through their ships, the truth became undeniable. Steel and fire lit up the blackness of space as the hidden Armada struck with precision, and raider ships that had terrorized countless colonies broke apart. In minutes their hulls shattered, and their commanders screaming in disbelief. On the surface of Vela, the people who had been huddled in the dark shelters felt the ground tremble as human dropships cut through the sky and landed with disciplined soldiers moving in formation, their armor gleaming under the glow of the burning city. Children peeked from behind their parents and their eyes widened because the figures that stepped out were not myths or shadows, but flesh and blood, and they fought with a power that seemed unstoppable. Ethan Carter coordinated the landing teams, and his orders were simple: protect the civilians, hold the streets, push the raiders back, and his teams moved with a speed the aliens had never seen. Laura Mitchell remained on the flagship, her voice calm, as she guided the fleet through waves of resistance, and her crew obeyed with loyalty, born of years of hidden training. The raider commanders tried to rally their ships, but fear spread faster than commands, and many turned and fled, broadcasting desperate signals that carried across the stars, repeating the same words: humans are real and they are here. Those words spread faster than any ship and reached places far beyond Vela, and in council halls and marketplaces, in mining stations and war barracks. The whispers grew louder because the myths had returned, and they carried an armada behind them. On the surface of Vela, the people came out of their shelters slowly and carefully, watching as human soldiers secured the burning streets and offered food and water to the terrified survivors, and many cried in disbelief, touching the armor of their rescuers to make sure they were real. Ethan Carter knelt beside a young boy who asked if they were going to leave too, and Ethan smiled softly and told him that humanity had been gone for a long time, but they had never truly left, and now they were here to stay. And the boy's eyes lit up with hope. Above the planet, Laura Mitchell watched the raider fleet collapse into chaos, and she ordered a final strike to make sure none of the attackers would return, and when the last explosion faded into the dark, she whispered that the HFY galaxy would never again call humans a myth. The Armada remained in orbit, their presence like a storm waiting to roll across the stars, and every living being who had seen that day would carry the memory forever, because the return of humanity was no longer a story told in fear or hope. It was now a truth written in fire and steel, and the galaxy was changing. The battlefield above Vela was silent now, except for the drifting wrecks of raider ships that burned as they fell into the gravity of the planet, and the human fleet moved with calm precision as crews secured their positions and scanned the stars for signs of more enemies. And on the ground, the survivors looked to the sky with wonder, because what they had thought was the end had instead become the moment they learned that myths could walk in steel. Laura Mitchell stood on the bridge of her flagship, and her face was calm, though her heart carried the weight of what had just happened, and she knew this was only the beginning, because the galaxy would hear about this day, and no one could stop it. Ethan Carter sat beside a console reading transmissions that poured in from across the rim, and every channel repeated the same word: human, and it spread like a fire out of control, moving from pirate fleets to smugglers to traders, and finally, to the halls of the council. The raider survivors fled in broken ships, screaming into their comms that the humans had returned, and that no weapon could stop them, and some ships did not even wait for orders, as they abandoned the battlefield and vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind allies who were cut down without mercy. In the council chamber, panic filled the air as envoys brought shaky recordings of the battle, and the images were clear: human warships tearing through fleets with weapons no one had seen before, and human soldiers marching on the surface with precision and compassion as they saved civilians while crushing enemies with terrifying strength. Some counselors shouted that the recordings were fakes. Some said it was impossible. Some even laughed to hide their fear. But others sat silent, staring at the proof, because deep down, they had always feared that the whispers were true. Daniel Harris sat in his dark operations room on Earth, his hands folded as he prepared a message that would confirm everything. And he knew once that message was sent, the shadows would no longer protect humanity. and there would be no turning back. He looked at the officers around him and saw in their eyes the same mixture of fear and resolve that lived in his own. And he spoke in a quiet voice, saying that the time of waiting was over, and that the galaxy had to know the truth. Above Vela, Laura Mitchell ordered her crews to hold position and to begin repairs, and she stood looking out into the endless night. And she thought about how many worlds were waiting for hope, and how many enemies were waiting for fear. Ethan Carter moved through the deck speaking to soldiers who had just returned from the ground, and he heard their stories of frightened children who had clung to them, and of survivors who had cried when they realized their rescuers were real and alive, and he felt the truth settle in his chest that they could never go back to being hidden. Across the galaxy, signals spread carrying fragments of desperate raider transmissions and frightened colonial reports, and even distorted images of human ships cutting through fleets, and in every place the same phrase was spoken. The humans are real and they have returned. In dark corners of the galaxy, warlords began to whisper about the danger, and some plotted to unite before humanity grew stronger, while others already planned to flee to the farthest reaches of space. In the Great Council Hall, leaders argued louder than ever. Some demanded immediate war against these newcomers. Some begged to send envoys and learn their purpose, and others feared that no army could stand against what they had seen. Daniel Harris sent his message, and across the stars it echoed calm and direct. He confirmed that humanity was alive, and that they had never vanished, and that they had only waited and watched until the moment came when silence could no longer serve. And the words struck the galaxy like thunder. On Vela, survivors gathered in the streets offering thanks to soldiers who had saved them, and many wept as they touched the strange armor and asked if they would be safe now. And Ethan Carter told them yes, but he knew safety would not be simple, because every enemy of humanity now knew they had returned. Laura Mitchell stood at the window of her command bridge as the stars stretched endless before her, and she whispered that the galaxy would never again call them myths, and she knew that what had been a whisper had now become a storm, and soon every world would have to choose how to face it. The council chamber was filled with silence when the envoys returned from their journey, and their faces were pale, and their voices trembled because they had walked the corridors of the human flagship, and they had seen with their own eyes that the myths were true, and that the humans had come back, and the weight of that truth pressed on every leader present. The envoy spoke of steel corridors alive with disciplined soldiers, and they spoke of weapons that hummed with strange energy, and of a commander named Laura Mitchell, who looked at them with calm, steady eyes and did not boast or threaten, but spoke in a voice that was firm and unshaken. They said she told them that humanity had never disappeared, they had only chosen to wait because the galaxy had grown sick with corruption and cruelty, and because the council had failed to protect the weak from raiders and tyrants. The envoys said that another man stood beside her named Ethan Carter, who explained their purpose with words that were clear. He said humans did not want to rule, but they would no longer stand aside while predators destroyed worlds. And he said their fleets would move to protect the innocent, whether the council approved or not. The chamber broke into chaos, with some leaders shouting that these were the words of conquerors, and others arguing that they were the words of guardians, and the debate turned fierce as every empire saw its future shifting. Daniel Harris listened from Earth as transmissions of the council debates reached him, and he sat in silence, knowing that the moment had come when myths had become power, and the galaxy was not ready. On the flagship, Laura Mitchell walked among her crew, speaking to them with calm encouragement, reminding them that they carried the weight of history on their shoulders, and she knew the galaxy would fear them, but she also knew that hope would rise where fear once ruled. Ethan Carter stood at the strategy table reviewing maps of star systems under constant attack, and he pressed his hand against the glass map with determination, because every point of light was a colony filled with lives that deserved safety, and he promised himself they would not be abandoned. Across the galaxy, the reaction spread like a storm. Some warlords cursed the humans and called for fleets to gather in resistance, while smugglers and pirates whispered that their days of easy prey were ending, and in colonies long forgotten by. The council people lit fires in the night to celebrate, because they believed salvation had come. In the council chamber, one delegate from a small empire broke down and admitted that his world had been left undefended for decades, and he begged that humanity be given a place at the table, but others shouted him down, fearing that giving humans legitimacy would mean the end of their own power. The debate grew darker and angrier until the chamber seemed ready to break apart. But beneath it all, the truth pressed heavy. No one could deny the proof of the fleets that had been seen, and no one could erase the images of soldiers moving with purpose on Vela. Laura Mitchell looked out at the stars from her bridge and whispered that the galaxy was standing at the edge of a new age, and Ethan Carter agreed, telling her that once the truth had been revealed, there was no path back to silence. Across the Council worlds, messages poured in from citizens demanding answers, demanding protection, demanding to know if the humans were allies or enemies, and the leaders realized they could not control the story anymore, because the people had already decided that the myths were real and that they had returned to change everything. In the stillness of night, Daniel Harris walked the quiet halls of his operations center and thought about the centuries of waiting and the sacrifices that had been made to keep humanity hidden, and he knew that now every choice would carry consequences that could not be undone. On the flagship, Laura Mitchell stood before her officers and told them that fear would spread faster than trust, and that they must be careful to show the galaxy not only their strength, but also their honor. And she told them that every action mattered because the eyes of every world were now watching them. Ethan Carter reminded the soldiers that the people they rescued would speak louder than any council decree, and that saving a child on a burning street meant more than 1,000 speeches, and the soldiers listened and nodded with pride because they understood. The galaxy trembled with uncertainty, but the Armada stood firm, and in the hearts of the weak a spark of hope was lit, and in the hearts of the cruel a seed of fear was planted, and nothing could undo what had been set in motion.